In 2005, at a hospital in Vietnam, a nurse sat at the bedside of her 14-year-old patient. It was after midnight, and the hospital was eerily quiet. The girl had been asleep for hours, but the nurse didn't dare get up or even take her eyes off the patient. She'd been told not to trust the girl. She had symptoms that nobody could explain, and her doctor thought she was doing something to fake her illness. And so it was the nurse's job to catch her in the act, or to watch her so carefully the girl didn't have a chance to pull whatever trick was making her seem sick. But not everyone thought the teenager was pretending to be sick. They agreed that she was not infected by a bacteria, a virus, or anything else from this earth. In fact, some of the hospital staff thought her symptoms might be caused by something otherworldly, maybe even holy. One of the nurses said the little girl's condition was proof of an actual miracle. The nurse who was keeping watch had worked in healthcare long enough to know that science could explain away even the strangest of cases. But she was also a religious person, and some small part of her hoped that this girl's condition was really a sign from God. Just then, the girl began tossing and turning like she was having a bad dream. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The nurse stood to grab a towel and wipe it off, but then, in the dark, she saw something, and the nurse's blood ran cold. She ran to call the doctor, and then she said a silent prayer, because what she just saw was not of this world, and she couldn't tell if it was a sign from God or the devil himself. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, please replace the Follow Button's toothpaste with mayonnaise, and then turn their water off in their house, so when they go to rinse their mouth out, they can't. This episode is called Stigmata. On a humid Monday morning in Vietnam in the fall of 2003, 12-year-old An Bui sat at her school desk. She was bent over her notebook, working on a writing assignment, when her left hand got sweaty and started cramping. She dropped her pencil to shake her hand out and noticed the pencil had blood on it. An looked down and saw a smear of blood across her palm, but she didn't remember cutting her hand on anything. She grabbed a tissue from her backpack and wiped off the blood. She thought maybe the pencil had given her a splinter, but she couldn't see a cut anywhere. And the red liquid on her palm definitely was not paint or some other substance. It was blood, and it seemed to have come out of nowhere. An didn't like it when people looked at her, so she threw the bloody tissue into her backpack before anybody noticed. She decided not to tell anyone what had happened. The blood must have just gotten on her hand at some point that morning, and she didn't notice. An figured whatever it was not worth worrying about. So she turned her attention back to the lesson and tried to put the strange moment out of her head. A few months later, An was reading at her desk, trying to ignore a headache. It was hot and muggy, which only made the headache worse. Her forehead was covered in sweat, and she felt a bead of moisture slide down her nose. She wiped it with the back of her hand, and as she did, she noticed a smear of blood. Her forehead was bleeding. An immediately looked down at her desk and let her hair fall around her face so nobody could see it. She tried to be inconspicuous as she touched her forehead, searching for a cut. The skin was unbroken, but there was more blood on her fingertips. And to make matters even stranger, there was a small pool of blood in her palm as well. She was stunned. Blood seemed to be seeping out of her hand and forehead for no reason. Then, An heard someone whispering behind her. She turned around and saw two of her classmates huddled together and pointing at her. Then another girl noticed and tapped the boy next to her on the shoulder. Within seconds, the whole class was gawking at her. An was mortified. She darted out of the room and down the hall to the bathroom. She made sure nobody else was inside. Then she turned on the faucet and scrubbed her hands and face until all the blood was gone. And then after that, she inspected her forehead and palms in the mirror, but there weren't any cuts on her body. An couldn't understand where this blood was coming from, but she still didn't want to tell the teacher or her mom. To her, that would just make the whole problem worse. And right now, all she wanted to do was forget this morning ever happened. One afternoon, a year later, An's mother, Tui, was walking An home from school. She tried to ask her daughter about how her day went, but An just stared at her feet as they shuffled down the busy sidewalk. An, who was 13 years old now, had spent the past year acting very quiet and withdrawn. She was always checking her reflection in shop windows and running her hands over her face like she was checking for acne or something. Plus, An wasn't in any school activities this year. An had always been shy, but she was becoming a loner. Tui wasn't sure what to do about it. Once they got home, An kicked off her shoes and went straight into the living room without saying a word. But Tui cried out in surprise when she saw that An was leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the ceramic floor. She ran to her daughter to see if she was hurt. An whirled around and looked down at the floor, but instead of checking her feet for an injury, she began wiping her forehead and inspecting her palms. Tui asked what was going on, but An didn't say anything. Instead, she just flopped down onto the couch and buried her face in her palms. Tui felt like her daughter must be hiding something, and so speaking very firmly, she told An to explain right now. An looked up, her face shiny with sweat. Then, red droplets began falling down An's forehead. Tui couldn't believe her eyes. It looked like An was sweating blood. But An didn't seem shocked by this at all. Instead, An just seemed sort of embarrassed. Then Tui remembered something. Over the past year, she'd occasionally found small traces of blood on An's clothes. She hadn't thought much of it. She figured An got little scrapes and cuts sometimes, like all kids do. But now, Tui asked her daughter if all those stains had been this bloody sweat. An nodded and said yes, then burst into tears. An said she was absolutely miserable. For the past year, in addition to sweating blood, she'd been spontaneously bleeding from her palms, the soles of her feet, her scalp, sometimes her arms and legs, and even her torso. And so her classmates thought she was really weird, and they made fun of An every time this happened. And also her friends didn't talk to her anymore because of the bleeding. The whole school basically shunned her for being this freak. An said she had tried her best to hide the bleeding, but occasionally she would bleed through her school uniform and everybody would see. Tui didn't know what to think. I mean, she couldn't believe that she hadn't realized this was going on. But at this point, all she thought was her daughter clearly needed help. She had to get An to the doctor as soon as possible. A few days later, a physician at the local hospital named Dr. Nai Nguyen stood in an exam room with An and Tui. As she inspected An's scalp, An explained how this spontaneous bleeding had basically made her a laughingstock at school and was ruining her life. Now, Dr. Nguyen could tell that An was clearly deeply distressed here. But far more pressing to the doctor were these symptoms. They were so confusing. Dr. Nguyen had never heard of anybody spontaneously bleeding from their extremities like this. It was totally alarming, and while Dr. Nguyen would never say this out loud, especially to An, it was a bit creepy too. The doctor was very cautious as she combed through An's hair, searching for cuts, scars, ulcers, anything that might explain the bleeding. But there was no markings of any kind on An's scalp or anywhere else on her body. And so after the exam, Dr. Nguyen peeled off her latex gloves and told Tui that she wanted to admit her daughter to the hospital to run some more tests. She would test An's blood to see if An had an underlying disease like anemia or a blood clotting problem, which might explain the sudden bleeding. She would also check for infectious disease. Whatever was wrong with An, Dr. Nguyen was confident that the lab work would show what was going on. But a few days later, Dr. Nguyen got the test results back. And An's blood work, her urine test, the chest x-ray Dr. Nguyen ordered, all of these tests came back normal. On paper, An was completely healthy. Even a malaria test came back negative. Dr. Nguyen couldn't find a single reason for An's bleeding. And unfortunately, even though An claimed to have bled at least a few times since being admitted to the hospital, Dr. Nguyen had never been present to witness the onset of the bleeding, which made Dr. Nguyen consider a different possibility. An said she often bled from her palms, feet, forehead, and torso. And while Dr. Nguyen was not Christian, she still knew these were the same locations on the body where, according to Christian doctrine, Jesus had bled from during his crucifixion. And according to some Christians, they believe these wounds can appear on others like a holy marking. These markings, which mirrored the wounds from the nails in Jesus' hands and feet, the crown of thorns on his forehead, and the spear wound in his side, are known as stigmata. And so Dr. Nguyen began to wonder if An wasn't actually sick, but faking these stigmata-like wounds for religious reasons, or just for attention. An did say that everybody in school knew who she was now because of this bleeding, so she was getting lots of attention. She said they treated her like a freak, but Dr. Nguyen knew that attention seekers didn't always search for positive validation. Negative attention could feel just as rewarding. If An was faking this, that would also explain why An hid the condition from her mom for more than a year, and why no one at the hospital had actually seen An while she was actively bleeding. The blood always seemed to appear when she was alone, so doctors hadn't been able to determine where it was actually coming from. Dr. Nguyen realized this situation was going to be very tricky. An would almost certainly insist that her symptoms were real, and it would be up to Dr. Nguyen to figure out if she was lying or in genuine need of medical intervention. The next morning, Dr. Nguyen walked into An's hospital room as An was finishing breakfast. Tui sat in a chair against the wall, flipping through a magazine. Dr. Nguyen closed the door for privacy and told Tui and An about the test results. She explained that without any evidence, it was going to be very difficult to diagnose An with a medical condition. As An and Tui absorbed the news and looked pretty upset about it, Dr. Nguyen turned to An and told her very gently that, school can be very stressful and bullying especially can make people really upset. And so it would be totally understandable if when An was feeling overwhelmed at school, that maybe she had begun to fake these symptoms, maybe to get out of a test or just to get out of a room or something. But the second Dr. Nguyen said this, An just stared at her with a look of pure disbelief on her face. She promised Dr. Nguyen that she had never faked the bleeding. She said she would just feel achy sometimes and then the blood would appear. She had no idea why this was happening, but it was ruining her life. She would never do this on purpose. Now, Dr. Nguyen was expecting this reaction, and so in an attempt to catch An off guard, she just said, An, are you causing these wounds yourself to look like the stigmata? An and her mother exchanged very confused glances. Tui shifted uncomfortably in her seat and explained that they were not Christian, they were Buddhist. There was nothing in their beliefs about bleeding hands or feet, and An said she'd never even heard of stigmata. The room fell into a brief silence, and then Dr. Nguyen had to admit that if An wasn't Christian, it was unlikely she was faking stigmata wounds. She could still be faking the symptoms for attention, but Dr. Nguyen still thought it was possible that An truly had a mysterious medical illness. And so if Dr. Nguyen was going to be able to help An, she would need more information. And so on her way back to her office, Dr. Nguyen stopped at the nurse's station, and she gave the staff strict orders to watch An closely and to let her know if the girl did anything unexpected or strange. A few hours later, Dr. Nguyen was getting ready to go home when she got a call. An Bui was bleeding. Dr. Nguyen hurried down the hallway to An's room, and when she stepped inside, she saw An sitting on the bed just staring back at her, and there was blood all across her pillow. An's mother was standing next to the bed looking very confused. Dr. Nguyen asked Tui if she had seen the bleeding begin, but Tui said no, she was asleep when it started. When Dr. Nguyen looked over at the nurse on duty, she shook her head no as well. She had not seen the bleeding start. She said that she had checked on An 15 minutes earlier and nothing was happening, and when she came back, An was bleeding. Dr. Nguyen snapped on a pair of latex gloves and then told An she was going to search for the source of the bleeding. Then she started moving her fingers through An's hair and pressing down on her scalp. And as she did, she could see blood smeared in An's hair, but she couldn't tell where it was coming from. She asked if An was in any pain, and An said yes, she had a headache, and she said she was feeling very tired. Finally, after not finding the source of the bleeding, Dr. Nguyen stepped back and told An that she wanted to take a few samples of the skin from An's scalp for testing. The procedure was called a punch biopsy. She would numb An's scalp and then cut out 3 little patches of skin and hair follicles, each about 3 millimeters long. After hearing this, An began to cry and said she did not want another test. Dr. Nguyen nodded and said she understood, but she told An this test could help them figure out what was actually wrong with her, and then hopefully she could get treated and go home. It took a minute for An to calm down, but eventually she did, and then she told the doctor she was ready to get started. The following morning, Dr. Nguyen received the biopsy results, and they showed something fascinating. An's scalp was covered in these microscopic pockets filled with blood. Dr. Nguyen didn't know why these spaces had formed or what was causing them to burst, but she intended to find out. Dr. Nguyen, during the biopsy, had also collected some of the bloody mixture that coated An's scalp, and results showed that it was actually a mixture of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and sweat. And it was the sweat that gave Dr. Nguyen an idea. She told An to go to the stress testing room in the cardiology department, and when Dr. Nguyen arrived, An was already standing glumly on the treadmill. An stared angrily at Dr. Nguyen, while a technician clipped the safety cord to her shirt, and a nurse double-knotted An's shoelaces. Dr. Nguyen couldn't blame An for being annoyed here, but she didn't have time to argue with an angry child. She had a case to solve. Because the bloody mixture contained sweat, Dr. Nguyen wondered if she could induce the bleeding with vigorous exercise, and so she was going to have An sprint on the treadmill to see if she could make her sweat turn red. Once everything was all set up, Dr. Nguyen nodded to the technician. The treadmill belt began moving, and the technician ramped up the speed until An was running. In no time, she was breathing hard and sweating. Except there wasn't any blood in the sweat. So Dr. Nguyen had the technician turn up the speed of the treadmill. As the belt moved faster, An struggled to keep up. Dr. Nguyen crossed her fingers, hoping that blood would appear on the girl's forehead. An's face grew pink and then beet red from the exertion. For a moment, Dr. Nguyen thought the blood was poking through An's skin, but then she realized An was just bright red from running so hard. Her sweat was still clear. Dr. Nguyen felt defeated as she told the tech to shut the treadmill down. Dr. Nguyen forced herself to smile. She told An she did great work, but she was secretly very frustrated. If a stress test didn't cause the bloody sweat, Dr. Nguyen didn't know what would, and so it made her turn back to her initial suspicion, that An might somehow be causing the bleeding herself. Now, she couldn't understand how An might make her own scalp bleed, but it had been more than a week, and still no one at the hospital had seen the actual onset of An's bleeding. Her own mom hadn't even seen it. And so if An was deceiving everybody, then Dr. Nguyen wanted to put an end to it, today. And so Dr. Nguyen pulled An's nurse aside and told her to sit by An's bedside overnight and to watch the child like a hawk. She told the nurse not to leave An alone, not even for a moment. A few hours later, An was startled awake in her hospital bed. Her forehead was pounding and she was drenched in sweat. It took a moment for An's eyes to focus, but when they did, she realized her nurse was standing right over her, looking absolutely stunned. An sat up and instinctively felt her face, and as she did, she immediately understood why this nurse was staring at her. An's face was covered in red, sweaty blood. She could feel it oozing out of her pores and trickling down her chin. But instead of helping her clean up, the nurse was just gawking at her. An closed her eyes and hoped the nurse would go away. She felt like a zoo animal on display for the whole hospital. When she opened her eyes again, the nurse was still looming over her, but instead of staring at her, the nurse smiled and told An she was going to call Dr. Nguyen. And she told An that she was now certain An could not be faking her symptoms. An was so relieved. A few days later, An would get her diagnosis. Once An had begun bleeding in her sleep in full view of that nurse, Dr. Nguyen was convinced the bleeding truly was spontaneous. But she still didn't understand why it was happening. After thoroughly searching medical literature for cases of spontaneous bleeding from the hands, feet, and head, Dr. Nguyen eventually discovered a rare condition that matched An's presentation. Its scientific name is hematidrosis. Now, not much is known about hematidrosis, but it's a condition that causes tiny blood vessels in the skin to break open. The blood inside these vessels might get squeezed out through the sweat glands or leak into hair follicles, causing the patient to essentially sweat blood. Doctors don't know exactly what triggers hematidrosis, but they think it could be related to stress, like the fight-or-flight response. This condition has been reported only in a limited number of documented cases, making it difficult to study extensively. However, there are some historical reports of similar cases. Some scholars believe that many documented cases of stigmata throughout history were actually just misdiagnosed cases of hematidrosis, which technically would have made Dr. Nguyen's initial diagnosis correct. An was suffering from stigmata, but not for religious reasons. In fact, Dr. Nguyen never discovered what actually caused An's bleeding episodes. But she did find a way to cure them. Dr. Nguyen prescribed An lorazepam, a mild benzodiazepine commonly used to treat depression. It helped reduce An's anxiety, and after 2 months on the medication, the bleeding stopped.
In 1956, the SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship. But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the two ships, it was too late, a collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. And unbeknownst to his co-workers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria, and just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries, and he ran towards the front of the Stockholm, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the Stockholm was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash. On April 27, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field and they start digging. And pretty quickly their shovels strike something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she'd been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out, and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewey. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewey's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewey last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewey relented, and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her, and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewey's belongings inside, Siraji said, "Okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make." And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewey, he had also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women. And if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them. And he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground. And he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep. And then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized. And then at this point, Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewey, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewey that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewey was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house. They went through the cemetery out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison. Around midnight on September 3rd, 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife. They talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, what are you doing here? And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway and he saw that Kristen wasn't home and it looked like nobody was home. And so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the 2 of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long the 2 of them were struggling on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down. Wayne throws her some cord. She ties up her husband's arms and legs. And then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole. And then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in. And then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again. And then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table, and then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other 2 miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol, and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown.